I just remember they shut off my electricity. I didn't have a blanket. I remember I didn't have sheets, I didn't have a blanket. I was wrapped in a sheer curtain watching the sunrise and set for days on end. Hey guys, I'm beaming in from Joshua Tree in the California desert. People often ask me, why did you get sober? And there's this really important concept people talk about in 12-step, which is the gift of desperation. And people like to use that because it's kind of an acronym, G-O-D. There's like this divine grace in hitting bottom. So I want to talk about hitting bottom and what that looked like for me. So I had been living in Berlin for about 3 years. And at the end of that 3 years, I was basically taking whatever anybody would hand me, whatever dry goods, as they like to say, anybody would hand me. I would drink too, but drinking was an accessory behavior, I would say. There were a couple of snapshot moments that really crystallized the turning point for me. I had tested HIV positive pretty early on at my time in Berlin. And I didn't really know where I had gotten it, but it was likely sometime when I was very high, and because I didn't ever remember having unprotected sex. I was partying at Berghain, which I've made a couple videos about now. I was just starting on my HIV medication. And so when you're on your HIV medication for a few months, usually, you achieve an undetectable status. And what that means is that you have so few copies of the virus in your bloodstream that you're basically deemed undetectable. Yes, the virus lives somewhere dormant in your body, but it's not really showing up in your bloodstream anymore. And at that point, you're no longer transmittable. So you can't pass the virus on to anybody else once you achieve undetectable state. And there's this really helpful catchphrase, U equals U. Undetectable equals untransmittable. But I digress. So I had not achieved undetectable status yet, which meant I was very conscious of my blood and the fact that it contained this contamination in my eyes. I had this really, really deep-seated negative feeling about being HIV positive at the time. I hadn't really integrated it yet, and I felt, dirty, and I just had all these horrible perceptions that had been passed down to me and fears. And we were doing ketamine, which we always would crush before doing it. You would crush it very finely because it was like sharp. Excuse the sniffle, I have a little cold. And I guess we didn't crush it enough, because I remember being on the dance floor in Panorama Bar. It's the upstairs dance floor in Berghain, which is a little more like house and disco music-y. And I was having a great time, whatever, feeling myself. And then I start to notice people are looking at me in horror. And I was like, feeling like I was waking up in this nightmare, kind of like, what's going on, why is it? And everybody's suddenly making way and backing up for me. And I start to realize there's blood all over my hands. And I had gotten a really bad nosebleed. And a nosebleed that I've never had a nosebleed so intense. I mean, just gushing blood, I think, was all over my mouth and on my shirt. And my friend was working the bar, and he saw me, and he's like, oh, let's get you napkins or whatever. And I was actually hanging out with another friend who was also HIV positive, and he I think there was this implicit understanding of the anxiety that I was having, especially because, I was such a stoner. Like, I would smoke joints all the time, and then it was like, oh my God, what if my blood is on the joint that I roll? And I just remember this horror that I felt. And there are no mirrors in Berghain, so I never saw what I looked like, but I saw how other people saw me, and it really got to me. So that stands out for me. And then there was another time when I had mixed ketamine and GHB. And some of the people in the comments in the last 2 videos said that I should really talk more about certain mixtures. And so that's a particular mixture that, from what I understand, is particularly lethal, or has the potential to be lethal. And I normally didn't mix them that much, but this one night, it was my birthday, it was my 22nd birthday or something, Taylor Swift. And I had done a lot of both. And I remember fighting to stay conscious, just like fighting with all my might. And I ran into my friend who I had gone out with, and he was like, hey, how you doing? And I felt this pressure to act like things were normal, just act like I was fine. And he could see in my eyes that I was not fine. And thank God he grabbed me and he brought me back to the place he was staying. And I think they ran me a bath or something, and that, you know, I was supervised. It wasn't like a dangerous situation, and except for the fact that I was potentially overdosing, which was very dangerous. But I just mean, like, there wasn't risk of me drowning. That was the closest I got to the edge, I would say. And, you know, I would see, like, at the club, sometimes these leather daddies or whatever would come up to me, and they'd sort of start dancing with me, and they'd try to wrap my arms around them, and they'd have this kind of aggressive sexual energy, and then they would just collapse out of my arms, like dead weight. And then sometimes they'd like get back up and then start trying to seduce me again, and then they'd collapse again. So I had seen it firsthand for sure. But that was the closest I ever got. Sort of fast forward to the very end of my time in Berlin. So while I was there, I threw these huge events. That was like my culmination of my time in Berlin, as I did these large-scale party installation events called Zerstört, which is German for destroyed. Apologies if my pronunciation is not perfect. So at the end of all of those events, I had moved out to Wedding. I had taken over an ex's apartment. I was living in Wedding. And if you don't know Berlin, like that's very kind of outskirts, especially compared to where, you know, people my age in the queer scene lived for the most part. But I was living there, and I was just so isolated. And I had failed to pay my utilities bill because I found it confusing in German, and I just avoided it. I just did drugs and I avoided problems. And I didn't have a blanket. I remember I didn't have sheets, I didn't have a blanket. I was wrapped in a sheer curtain at night and a bare mattress. I just remember they shut off my electricity. They shut off the Wi-Fi, they shut off the electricity. And I was alone in this apartment, lying in bed all day, watching the sunrise and set for days on end, 2-3 days on end. And that was really the bottom for me. And in program they say, you know, if you want to hit bottom, stop digging. If you want to know where your bottom is, stop digging. And I guess that's the moment I stopped digging. And what it looked like for me is I thought in my head, who do I know that's a mental health professional? And the first name that came to mind was a therapist I had when I was 13. And I found her info, and I went to a Turkish cafe nearby where they had Wi-Fi and did my first therapy session with her. And with her help, and with the help of my social worker at my doctor's office in New York, and with the help of this 12-step program that I got brought into by this person I started dating, I found my way back towards stability. I just thought, you know, given the context of these other videos where I was talking about like sensational things about nightlife and these things I saw, and like, you know, I thought it might be interesting to just hone in on my own story for a second and talk about how bad it got. Like all things, there are good sides and bad sides. There's a version of Berlin and partying in Berlin that I'm sure has none of that dark energy. But that was the life I lived. If you're interested in hearing more about sobriety, comment. I'd like to talk about the LGBT community and mental health issues a lot more. If you have specific topics, sound off. I'd love to hear from you.